Thank you so much for joining us once again here on our Connecting Conversations with Cohesia Connect. I'm so delighted to introduce our guest today. It's Tanya Marwaha. Would you like to introduce a little bit about yourself, Tanya? We're so honoured to have you here on Connecting Conversations. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Thank you. It's so lovely to be here. So, thank you for the lovely introduction. I'm Tanya, 21 years old, and it's quite complicated because I feel like I wear a lot of hats that I change quite interchangeably. So, in my day job, I am an employee experience analyst at Willis Towers Watson. So a lot of the communications that you'd see as an employee, we're the behind the scenes guys who do all of that stuff, which is really interesting and ties into a lot of the things that I'm passionate about outside of my 9 to 5. So when I was at university, I started a youth-led mental health community called Championing Youth Minds, which is what I've dedicated the last 2 years and a bit to. That really came from my own lived experience with my mental health and wanting to empower and educate other young people to take care of their mental well-being daily, because unfortunately there's quite a gap in our education system.
Yeah.
But it's such a key topic that I think every young person should have access to. I should feel confident that, when a difficult situation comes, because life is full of those ups and
Yeah.
downs, that they feel that they're capable and they know who to go to, but they also know how they can take care of their mental well-being. And through that, I've kind of fallen into the wider world of D&I. So when I was at university, I also started writing a blog about my lived experience living with non-visible disabilities. So I live with fibromyalgia, which is chronic widespread pain, and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a connective tissue disorder. So to contextualize that on a day-to-day basis, that means that since I was around 12, I don't really remember what not being in pain feels like. So it's my entire body. So right now it's my knees and my spine, and chronic fatigue. And also there's so many other comorbidities that come with these conditions. So it is really just a journey of figuring out, kind of trying to understand what's going on with my body, and managing that in the best way. So I've been really lucky to be able to take that on, stages, to be able to share my story, because I really do think it's something that we don't talk enough about, and a lot of us do mask in our day-to-day life when it comes to whether it's our physical struggles or our mental struggles or both, because they are so interlinked. So that's just a brief overview of who I am.
And yet so full and incredible. Thank you so much for sharing. That's a wonderful introduction. And for someone who's 21, still so young and finding their way in the world, it appears that you've accomplished so much already. Was this always the dream job, or has it kind of found you, if that makes sense?
No, it wasn't the dream job. Growing up, I had so many dream jobs. Once I wanted to become like a food critique, I wanted to be
I
a
love
police
that.
officer, I wanted to be a journalist. It was kind of whatever I saw, I fixated on that.
Yeah, yeah.
But kind of this passion came from, like I said, started struggling with my health when I was around 12, 13 years old. And then I embarked on this entire journey for 6 to 7 years where I didn't have a diagnosis. So I was just back and forth between doctors. And I think those experiences that I had growing up, going from being child to teenager, going into university, experiencing all of that, now into the world of work, I just found so many places where I didn't feel supported, I didn't feel understood. And when I went to go look for resources, there was nothing, or there was, but no one could speak to me. It kind of felt like nothing related to me. So that's kind of what got me into this space, really just a passion and a drive to want to make an impact and make sure that those moments where I felt like I was alone, that fewer and hopefully no one feels that they're alone and they don't have anywhere to go and they don't have the support. But yeah, I'm still on that journey now of figuring out how I want that, what form I want that to take in my life, because there's so many different forms, and we're lucky to live in a world where social media and everything has us experimenting with lots of different ways that we can
Yeah.
get that message across.
Absolutely. I think firstly, kudos to you and your courage, because as much as it is something that I think so many people would resonate with, nobody really wants to feel alone. It still takes a lot to continue to walk alone, to be the pioneer. And it sounds like that's exactly the space that you're filling. Has that for you, has it attracted others like yourself in the work that you're doing? You mentioned, you're an analyst, you're a mental health D&I speaker, charity founder, of Championing Youth Minds. These are not small feats that you've done. Have you found your tribe or your people in stepping out in the ways that you have in these areas, which, as you said, already came from such a personal space of just wanting to feel that there was space for people that went through the experiences that you shared?
Definitely. I'd say most of the people that, I feel myself most around or when speaking to have kind of come through this fear of doing these things, getting put out there, and then when you're just really lucky and people just come your way. So I'm really grateful in that sense, and it's really made me once again realize that I'm not alone and just invigorate that passion even more of, there's more than just me. We can all kind of do this together and collaborate in a way that there's so much I've learned from these other people. There's similarities in our lived experience, but there's also so much that I can learn from them and hopefully they can learn from me. So that's been really great. And it's just amazing that, when you're at school or when you're at university, you just don't realize how much others in the world has to offer.
Mm.
And I feel really lucky that I've kind of found this path where I've been able to connect with others. And hopefully that everyone can realize that sometimes the things that you think are like a disadvantage to you. So, for example, for me, I always used to think that my disability was a disadvantage and it held me back. Was that actually, like you said, it's kind of like a superpower and it's put me on
Yeah.
this path and it's allowed me to find these other amazing people. And there's so much beauty in that. And I like to say it's actually a gift.
Mm.
Had I not had that gift, I probably would have still been fluctuating between I want to be a police officer or a journalist or something like that. But I feel so much more grounded and kind of I have a drive to know where I want to go.
That's so incredible, and I know just listening to your story, one to one with you today, I'm so inspired. I can't even imagine how others must feel coming into contact when you're active in your work in these areas too. So you mentioned that you work a lot with other young people, others that have cross paths, and you have similar experiences and some very different experiences, but your drive and your passion is what connects you together. So within that kind of wide space that you've been in, what would you think have been some of the biggest challenges facing the youth of today and their
Mhm.
engagement with issues of diversity and inclusion? Particularly, you've mentioned that disability is one that is quite personal to you, but I imagine there's a lot of intersectionalities that you engage with, even on the path of your um, um, kind of like exposure to D&I stuff with your work. Would you be able to share a little
Mhm.
bit about that, please?
Definitely. I think there's quite a few challenges that young people still face. So the first one being is having your voice heard. Unfortunately, the younger you are, the more you're dismissed often. And I think especially when you have those intersectional identities come into play with that even more, you feel even more marginalized and dismissed. And that's something I've experienced, especially living with a disability and speaking out about it, but being from a South Asian background.
Mm,
It's very much not talked about still in our communities. And especially if you're a young person, it's kind of, you've got so much more to learn, so much more to live. So leave that to the elder people to kind of speak up about things. That's just my personal experience of it, but there's so many other reasons why young
mm,
people might feel that they're a bit dismissed or not heard. And I think a lot of it is just the day and age we're living in. So, for example, I experienced university during the pandemic, and that's a once in a lifetime thing for so many of us. And unfortunately, it's harder for other generations, for example, to connect and understand how difficult situations like that have been. And for example, I've been in the world of work for 6 months now, and everyone's talking about, returning back to the world of work before COVID, but so many of us don't know what that is, and we'll never be able to understand what that is because for us, this is the normal. This has always been the normal. So that's definitely one challenge. And I think the other challenge is as a young person, knowing what you're passionate about, but figuring out what's the best way to drive that passion forward, what type of impact you want to make. And imposter syndrome is really real in this space, and I don't think we talk about it enough. Um, you know, there's so many great spaces where you can connect with like-minded individuals who are really passionate and wanting to do things. But in that, it's so easy to compare to each and
mm,
every person's situation, kind of how they're going about it. But also, it's so easy to forget about yourself. So I talk a lot about mental health, but I can hold my hand up and say that there's been so many times that during that conversation, I've forgotten about my own mental health. And I've hit points where I felt really burnt out. And I've realized that actually I need to circle back to why I'm doing all of this, which is my experience. And I need to make sure I'm looking after myself first. And I think, especially when it comes to diversity and inclusion, a lot of it stems from lived experience, and a lot
Mm,
of those struggles that you want to repurpose into something positive and make an impact. But when we're having these conversations, sometimes we forget how difficult these conversations are to have, how
yeah.
there might be triggers in this conversation that actually when you come out of that conversation, you probably need time to just reflect and digest everything that's been spoken about. So a few weeks ago, I was at a mental health conference, and there was a lot of mention of, you know, poor mental health, suicide, and I just reflected about that. And I was like, for me, this has become a very normal conversation to have because it's something I do often, but I need to remember to check in with myself and make sure that I'm okay, despite the fact that this is something that I'm used to. So I think there's definitely lots of challenges. And I think as a young person, you'll always just come across barriers every single day, whether that's kind of the format through which you want to do your work, making sure you feel heard. How do you go about networking? There's so many skills that are still to learn, and you learn them on that journey. And it's not always the easiest journey. But
No.
that's, I guess, that, if you're someone who's truly passionate and motivated, you will still embark on that journey and just enjoy it however you can.
I love what you said there, and I think one of the biggest realizations, I think, and you've alluded to this already, is there is already such a wide gap between just the generation before yours in with what's happened in the changeover during the 2 pandemic years, and how much this has impacted already one generation in such a vast way that they will never be able to connect within the generation just gone before them. And like you say, experiencing the world of work, what does the world look like pre-COVID as someone that's been in employment to someone who never went into it before employment, is a really,
Mhm.
really big deal. And as you said, as a result of the pandemic as well, this influx of very different experience with regards to an uptake on people being a bit more, I think, fluent and engaging and exposed to issues of mental health, and just having the tools to identify that this is actually what's going on. That's never really been around before. Or certainly it was, but it didn't have as much of a center stage as it does now. And I also loved what you said. I think this is also so important, is just realizing that, particularly when we're dealing with issues of D&I, we can become so used to this is a general kind of conversational narrative that we come across all the time, but becoming numb to it is actually quite a big deal. And I think this is what perpetuates what we like to call today that element of diversity fatigue. I've heard it before so many times, but it's not making us stop and realize this is someone's real experience. This is a human being on the other end of what it
Mhm.
feels like to be in their skin or in their shoes and their experience. And it's not okay. And we should never be comfortable with that. But like you say, in order to drive the change, it's almost a bit like we're trying to prevent that one is cancelling out the other. We'll talk about it more, but we don't want to become numb to actually, or desensitized to the impact of what it should have of these very kind of true stories. I love how
Mhm.
you've reflected on that. That was beautifully said. And I think so important for us to continually have at the forefront of our minds, to be aware that we don't want to slip into that desensitized kind of space. So I believe also that you speak 5 languages. Is that correct? That is
Yeah.
an amazing feat. What are those 5 languages?
Yeah, so I grew up with Hindi, English, and Punjabi, and then when I was at school, I did Spanish for around 12 years up until A level. And then when I went into university, I was like, I want to do a language, but I've done Spanish for so long, I feel confident with it. Let me try something else. And I went to R.I.S.E, and they offered international relations and Mandarin. That was the only language combination they offered. So I was like, you know what, I'm just going to put myself through it. And it was a great experience. So I was actually meant to
Amazing.
be in Shanghai right now, but COVID happened. Everyone knows what happened, so I won't repeat that. But it was just such a lovely experience, and I think it's just taught me so much about kind of intercultural communication. Really being more compassionate and understanding of whoever's in front of you when you're having conversations or just engaging and interacting with others.
How has that impacted, I think, and I love that you said this is a very special tool to have in terms of
Mhm.
helping to bridge that gap, because my English language is only going to extend to a level of understanding of or comprehension of concepts and ideas, because my language restricts me by that. You having the ability to interchange between different languages and all the nuances that come with it and the cultural connotations that come with that, how has that impacted kind of like a broadening of your view when you've engaged with D&I issues?
Mhm. Yeah, I think the cultural aspect is a really interesting and important one. And I think it's something that, unless you've had exposure to those cultural nuances, as you mentioned, it's something people don't automatically think of. So
No.
growing up as like a British Indian, I was always aware of the cultural differences and how that impacts, conversation or just things that impact others. So for example, if we're on the topic of like DNI, I don't really think DNI is like a buzzword as much as it is in the Western world. Like I'm sure if
Yeah.
I went to family members and I was like, oh yeah, I do work around diversity and inclusion, they'd probably be like, what? What are you on about? So that's already a major difference. And it's really about kind of understanding what how people identify and how they use that identity. So I know I mentioned touched upon it earlier, is that the type of things that I speak up about in our community are not really things that, should really be spoken up about or to be necessarily proud of. We always have this notion of, being humble and putting others before you. And that's why when I say things like, you should put your own mental health before anything else, it's probably very contradictory to what others would expect to hear. And then when I was learning Mandarin, we had a lot of classes on just intercultural communication, and there was a
Mm,
lot of focus on making sure we understand the cultural context before just approaching it with the language. And there I learned so much more about, I thought kind of Indian culture was really about being humble, but when I learned more about kind of Chinese culture, I really understood what that meant and how that
yeah.
impacts interaction. So when I was at university, I had quite a lot of Chinese friends, and really understanding that, before we would judge that they're very to themselves, so it's very hard to get into that type of group. You then start to understand these stereotypes and these comments we make, where they stem from and how we can better understand the other person. So that's why when I talk about diversity and inclusion, one thing that's really important to me is that we're doing great in terms of the conversation in the UK or in the West, but there's still so much that needs to be said elsewhere. And also going back to your point about intersectionality, is that everyone has such different experiences, and sometimes what really bothers me is in the DNI space I see the same people having the same conversations, and I feel like it's really time that we kind of broaden that space up and make space for others. There already is a space, it's about letting them in and making sure their voices are heard, because for example, two of us could be in the DNI space and one person's voice is always going to be much louder,
Yeah.
for whatever reasons. So yeah, it's given me that understanding and allowed me to approach it from a more holistic point of view, and understand why certain individuals might not feel able to step into the space or have these conversations. It's not that it doesn't matter to them. It's not that it's not an issue that they should be speaking up on. It's just about all the other, elements that play a
Mm.
role in that.
And out of those cultures, it sounds firstly, again, a reflection on yourself that you're willing to engage on that space. And I don't think necessarily maybe everybody's comfortable to do that. And particularly as you said, in the Western world, we are kind of a little bit should I say, in our own corner with how we see things, how we view things, how we communicate those elements. And as you said, even in the DEI space, that seems to be quite a popular conversation here. But even that has had its limits when our considerations or our experiences, this is the one that's leading, say, for example, specific ones are leading the conversation or dominating it more than others. And it's
Mhm.
not allowing the space for the other elements of very valid DNI issues to come to the fore. So, out of your experience of the cultures you've been exposed to, what are some of the elements I think that you've kind of picked up and actually like this has really made me aware that there's maybe another space that we're not talking about here in Western
Mhm.
DNI so much. Were there any specific elements that arose that brought your attention to those at all?
Definitely. So more specifically within the mental health space, religion and mental health is still something we don't speak enough about. I think culture and mental health is also something we don't speak enough about, but more
Yeah.
specifically religion. So for example, one thing I talk a lot about, which always ends up surprising people, but for me it's quite a common thing. But for example, in the South Asian community, when you speak about mental health, we don't always think go to a doctor or go to a GP. We would think go to the priest. And that's a personal experience I've had, is that when I started, mentioning about my mental health, it was, let's ring up the priest in India, let's see, what's going on in your birth chart and how we can solve that. And a lot
Mm,
of times people will go months and years and so long seeking help from someone who's not in a position to help, but that's just the way our culture is, that's what our religion is. For
yeah.
example, as well, we talk a lot about the representation of mental health in media, but we
Mm,
don't think about it beyond the Western world. So a lot of Bollywood films still nowadays, we're getting to a better place, but still will represent mental health as someone who's in an asylum. And those type of conceptions, now that we live in a world where digitalization has connected us across boundaries, we need to understand how that still infiltrates within our Western world, and it's not always exactly how we want it to be and what we think it is. And so many people in the mental health space say, I've never heard of this before, why aren't we talking enough about this? So I can speak for myself, a lot of the kind of fear or the reason why I wouldn't speak up about my mental health is because if I'm just going to be put through to the priest, I don't want to speak to the priest. I don't want to try out, sleeping with my head facing north, or you're wearing a gem thinking that it's going to solve the problem. So that's just one example, but I'm sure so many of us have examples of those nuances that impact us so much, but we just don't hear it spoken about, and we don't have anyone who we can see in the space who's kind of pioneering that for us.
I think you raised such an important thing right there. That's so true. And particularly if I think people have always felt, I think maybe historically sometimes, that maybe that's quite taboo to speak about it, because if I see myself as someone who subscribes to a very strong faith, and that's quite personal as well for many religions and how people navigate that space, not or even admitting that there is maybe a need for help or support with regards to mental health actually can induce quite a bit of shame. And we need to find a way to bridge that gap, that actually this space is open for everyone to be able to be supported in a way, and this doesn't kind of undermine or invalidate their personal faith and their belief as well. I think that's a really, really valid point. Thank you for raising that. That's so important. So, as an ally and advocate for diversity, what advice would you give to those who want to kind of participate in building inclusion? And we've spoken about an arrangement of things. You're in your new kind of space with into the world of work now since graduating, and just in general, how could we move towards that space to building better inclusion and participation with people within this conversation? You've mentioned such a wonderful kind of like wide range of where you've seen the impact of D&I, or you've seen the impact of mental health within a variety of spaces. How can we engage more with that?
I think based off of everything I've said, and if anyone was to look at the stuff I'm doing, they'd probably think I do a lot of doing, and that's all I do. But I think I want to take a step back from that. And although it seems like I'm doing a lot of doing, I actually do a lot of
Mm,
listening. And I think that's something that we all need to do. I think when we talk about being an ally, or being in the space of D&I, we say a lot of the word doing, but a lot
yeah,
of it actually needs to be taking a step back and
yeah,
listening to those whose voices unfortunately are still somewhat dismissed or not as loudly heard as they should be, really understanding how identities intersection with each other. So I can
mm,
speak on top of my identities and how that impacts me, that someone with, you know, who might also be South Asian might have a completely different experience. So it's really about listening. And I think, especially in what I've noticed in kind of the workplace, is that everyone's very keen to do things and make sure that they're showing that they're doing things. But the first step before you do anything is to listen and to really understand what's going on and what needs to be done. And I think if we're talking on like a day-to-day basis, this is like conversations I have with my colleagues as well, is that a lot of it is just providing that space to
mm,
listen and for someone else to be heard. And then from then you can take that and think about, okay, is there a way that we can do something about it? Or,
yeah,
take those small steps to getting there. But I think the key thing is really listening. And that's kind of something that I've experienced throughout my life as well, which is why it's so key to me, is that there's been so many times where I just haven't felt heard and being listened to effectively. And I'm sure so many of us can relate to that for so many other reasons. But I think when we're in the space of D&I, it's less about finding a solution. It's more about listening to those who have that lived experience and then coming together collectively and finding a solution for it. And it's not going to be one solution. And one thing I always say is like D&I is it's a journey, it's not a destination. We're never going to get to a point and be like, great, big tick box, we fulfilled
yeah,
everything we need to fulfill. Because
right,
if you
absolutely.
look at decades ago, I'm sure there've been so many things that have come up in this space that probably you wouldn't have predicted that they would be a conversation years down the line. And that's
No,
just going to be the way that it continues to go. None of us could have predicted COVID and the conversation it would have brought about. So it's really just about, firstly, that listening piece is really about listening, and opening that space up to everyone, because it's not just a certain, a marginalized group who is going to be a player in the D&I space. Is everyone. And then also understanding that it's going to be an ongoing thing. We can't rush the process. The process is the journey in itself. And it will be constantly changing. You have to be open to learning as well. And it will include very uncomfortable conversations. So someone
Yes,
who
it
listening to
will.
this might think, oh, this is such an uncomfortable conversation to have. But that is part of the learning, and that's part of the listening piece as well, is to be having those uncomfortable conversations, challenging yourself. So, for example, a few weeks ago, I was talking about the topic of microaggressions and how that impacts
Mm,
individuals' mental health, for example. So, that's a very uncomfortable conversation to have. And you might think about, how can I have a conversation with someone who I think might be impacted by microaggressions? As uncomfortable as that feels, it's still, a step to take towards facilitating that safe space, facilitating that space where you can listen effectively to someone. So I think it's all just about listening, understanding that it's a long road ahead, and the road doesn't have a destination. We can't see the end of it. It's going to be ongoing.
no.
And yeah, to just really be keen to learn.
I think you really hit the nail on the head there. And I think one of the things that stuck out to me, particularly about what you just shared there, is we've got to, the starting place is a willingness to be open. We need to be
Mhm.
willing to listen, like you say, and then willing to, even when I've listened, and I'm going to be willing to do the time into enduring
Yeah,
past those uncomfortable conversations, because that's really where the work gets done. That's really where the impact and the change happens, is to be able to be both a participator and on the receiving end. And contributed to those conversations to engage and impact change. So I agree with you wholeheartedly. Tanya, it's been an absolute honor to talk with you today. Thank you so much for sharing both your story, your insights. There is so much I feel that we could learn from your journey so far. I sense such a weight and depth of what you bring to the table, and I'm so pleased to we've been able to connect with you in Connecting Conversations with Cohesia Connect, and so proud to be someone that would be able to stand beside you as an ally with what you stand for and are working towards. It's great to have met you, and we wish you all of the best with all of your future endeavours and projects.
thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for providing the space where such conversations can happen.
No problem at all. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.
Thank you.